I've been married to Melanie for 6 years. 6 long years. We didn't have kids, not because we couldn't, but because she didn't want them. She always said children would ruin her body, or tie her down, and I didn't argue too much. I figured we'd get to that point eventually, once she was ready. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. Our marriage wasn't bad, at least that's what I told myself. Melanie could be difficult, sure. She had this way of making every disagreement into a full-blown battle, complete with screaming, slamming doors, and the occasional insult that hit a little too close to home. But I loved her, or at least I loved the idea of her. Melanie had this fire in her that made me believe she was worth all the trouble. It all started to change when she started taking taxis everywhere. Melanie never liked driving, too stressful, she said. I didn't think much of it at first. She said she found a reliable driver named Tony, who always came when she called. She talked about him like he was some kind of savior. Tony is so dependable, she'd say. Not like the rest of those idiots. I was glad she had someone she trusted, especially since she had to run a lot of errands during the day while I was at work. But then the errands got longer. Trips to the grocery store turned into 2-hour outings. She'd come back smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't mine. And her mood? Completely unpredictable. One day she'd be sweet as pie, the next she'd blow up over something as small as me forgetting to take out the trash. I chalked it up to stress or hormones or whatever excuse I could come up with to avoid facing what was right in front of me. The first real crack appeared when I found a receipt in her purse. It was for a fancy restaurant across town, the kind of place we couldn't afford to eat at unless it was a special occasion. The date on the receipt? A random Tuesday afternoon when I knew she told me she was running errands. When I asked her about it, she barely flinched. "Oh, that?" she said, her tone as casual as if I'd asked about the weather. "I was meeting an old friend from high school. You wouldn't know her." An old friend? That didn't sound like Melanie. She wasn't the type to maintain friendships, especially with women. But I let it go. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who doubted his wife over something so small. Besides, Melanie was good at turning things around on me, making me feel like I was the one in the wrong for even asking. The next few weeks were more of the same. Late trips, vague excuses, and that damned cologne smell that clung to her like a guilty secret. One night, I decided to stay up and wait for her to get home. She'd gone out shopping around 7 p.m., and by midnight she still wasn't back. When she finally walked through the door, her hair was tousled, her lipstick smudged, and she reeked of that same cologne. "What the hell, Melanie?" I snapped. "Where have you been?" She rolled her eyes, dropping her purse on the counter like she couldn't be bothered to answer. "I told you, I went shopping." "Shopping for what? Perfume samples at a strip club?" That got her attention. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing into that familiar glare she used when she wanted to shut me down. "Oh, give me a break, Nick. You're acting paranoid. I can't even go out without you grilling me like some jealous boyfriend." "Jealous?" I laughed, but there wasn't anything funny about it. "You disappear for hours, come home smelling like another man, and I'm the crazy one?" Her response was to scoff and storm off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the closed door, wondering how the hell we'd gotten to this point. The Melanie I married wasn't like this. Or maybe she was, and I'd been too blind, or too stupid, to see it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, every little lie she told me, every red flag I'd ignored. I didn't want to believe she was cheating. Hell, I didn't even want to think about it. But deep down, a part of me already knew the truth. I just wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. This was just the beginning. The morning after that sleepless night, I decided to shake off my paranoia, or at least try. Work was a welcome distraction. Numbers, spreadsheets, and meetings didn't leave much room for my overactive imagination to run wild. But as the hours dragged on, my mind kept drifting back to Melanie and her late night shopping trips. By the time I got home, Melanie was already dressed up. Not casual, not business casual, No, she was in that tight red dress she usually reserved for our anniversaries or some fancy party. Her makeup was flawless, her perfume overpowering. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She glanced at me like I'd asked the dumbest question in the world. "Out. I told you yesterday I'm meeting Jenny for dinner." "Jenny?" I frowned. "Since when are you and Jenny close again? I thought you said she was a backstabbing drama queen." Melanie rolled her eyes, her patience clearly thinning. "God, Nick, people change. I can't believe I have to explain myself every time I step out of this house." Her phone buzzed, and she grabbed it off the counter with the speed of someone guarding a secret. She didn't even glance at me as she typed out a quick reply, her perfectly manicured fingers moving like lightning. That's when I saw the contact name, Tony. "You're texting the cab driver now?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Melanie froze, her eyes flicking up to meet mine for just a second too long. Then she laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound that only made me more suspicious. "What, I can't confirm a ride? What's your deal lately, Nick? You're acting so needy." Needy. That word hit harder than it should have. I didn't say anything else as she grabbed her purse and strutted out the door. The moment it closed behind her, I felt my stomach twist into knots. I wasn't needy. I wasn't paranoid. But something was definitely wrong, and I was done ignoring it. That night, I decided to take action. I wasn't proud of what I did, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Melanie's tablet was synced to her phone, and she wasn't exactly cautious about logging out of her accounts. It didn't take long for me to find what I was looking for, a string of texts between her and Tony, the dependable taxi driver. The messages weren't just casual. They were downright flirtatious. "Tony, can't stop thinking about last night. You looked so damn good in that dress." Melanie, "Haha, you're bad. I might just wear it again, just for you, winky face." Tony, "When are you free again? I've got a spot in mind where we won't get interrupted this time." My hands shook as I scrolled through the rest. There were pictures too, nothing graphic, but enough to make my blood boil. Melanie in the passenger seat of Tony's cab, her hand resting just a little too high on his thigh. Melanie leaning against the hood of the car, her dress riding up in a way that was anything but accidental. I slammed the tablet down on the counter, my chest heaving. I didn't want to believe it, but there it was, staring me in the face. Melanie wasn't just cheating on me, she was flaunting it, treating our marriage like it was some disposable piece of trash she could toss aside whenever she felt like it. I didn't sleep that night either. Instead, I planned. I wasn't about to let this go. Melanie might think she could outsmart me, but she was about to learn that I wasn't as naive as she thought. If she wanted to play games, I'd play too. The next day, I left work early and parked my car a few blocks away from our house. I waited. Sure enough, around 3 p.m., a yellow cab pulled up to the curb. Tony stepped out, a smug grin plastered across his face, and Melanie greeted him with a hug that was way too friendly for my taste. I followed them. It wasn't hard. Tony wasn't exactly subtle about where he was going. They ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town, the kind with hourly rates and flickering neon signs. I parked across the street and watched as they disappeared inside, my heart pounding in my chest. I should have stormed in right then and there. I should have confronted them, demanded answers, made a scene. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was just the sick need to gather more evidence. Whatever the reason, I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When they finally came out an hour later, Melanie looked flushed, her hair a mess. Tony's shirt was untucked, his belt hanging loose. They didn't even try to hide it. And as they drove off, laughing like a couple of lovesick teenagers, I realized something. I wasn't just angry. I was done. This wasn't just a mistake or a one-time lapse in judgment. This was who Melanie was, a liar, a cheat, a selfish, manipulative woman who cared more about her own desires than the vows she'd made to me. And I wasn't going to let her drag me down with her. But if she thought I'd go quietly, she had another thing coming. This was just the beginning. The day after following Melanie and Tony to that sleazy motel, I couldn't look at her the same way. Every time she smiled at me, every time she kissed me goodbye before heading out for one of her errands, all I could see was her tangled up with that cab driver, laughing at me behind my back. It was eating me alive. I knew I had to confront her, but I wanted to catch her red-handed first. I wasn't going to give her any room to twist the truth. That evening, Melanie came home late again, her usual excuse already loaded. Traffic was insane. She sighed, kicking off her heels and grabbing a glass of wine like nothing was wrong. Where were you, Melanie? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She glanced at me, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. I told you, Nick. I had a meeting with Jenny and some of the girls. Why do you keep asking? Because I followed you yesterday, I said, cutting straight to the point. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. There wasn't a flicker of guilt or panic. Instead, she laughed, a cold, condescending sound that made my blood boil. Followed me? She repeated, setting her glass down. What are you, some kind of stalker now? Jesus, Nick, you're pathetic. Don't turn this on me, I snapped, standing up. I saw you, Melanie. I saw you with Tony at the motel. That wiped the smirk off her face. For a moment she froze, her eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge how much I actually knew. Then, just as quickly, her expression shifted to feigned indignation. You're delusional, she said, shaking her head. Tony gave me a ride to meet Jenny, and you just happened to see him at the motel after dropping me off. God, Nick, you're embarrassing yourself. Her lie was so smooth, so calculated, that for half a second, I almost believed her. But then I remembered the texts, the pictures, the way she'd looked when she walked out of that motel with her hair a mess and her lipstick smeared. I wasn't stupid, and I wasn't about to let her gaslight me into thinking I was. Cut the crap, Melanie, I said, stepping closer. I saw the texts. I saw the pictures. You've been screwing him, haven't you? Her face turned red, not with shame, but with fury. You went through my phone? Are you kidding me right now? You violated my privacy, Nick. Do you know how insane that is? You're calling me insane? I shouted, my voice rising. You're the one cheating on me, lying to my face, and you have the nerve to act like the victim? I'm not cheating, she screamed back, her voice reaching that shrill, hysterical pitch I'd come to dread. You're imagining things because you're so damn insecure. Maybe if you weren't such a boring, miserable husband, I wouldn't have to look for excitement elsewhere. And there it was. She didn't even realize what she'd just said. Her face paled slightly, but she recovered quickly, crossing her arms and glaring at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. You know what? I said, my voice cold and steady now. I'm done. You want excitement, Melanie? Go ahead and have it. But you're not going to do it while you're married to me. She rolled her eyes, letting out an exasperated sigh. Oh, stop being so dramatic, Nick. You're not going anywhere. You can't even take care of yourself without me. That was the moment something snapped inside me. For years I'd let her walk all over me, let her tantrums and manipulations dictate the terms of our marriage. But this time, I wasn't backing down. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice firm. You can keep Tony and his crappy cab, but you're not keeping me. Her reaction was explosive. She hurled the wine glass at the wall, shards of glass scattering across the kitchen floor. You think you're going to leave me? She shrieked. You think you're better than me, Nick? You're nothing without me. Nothing. I didn't stick around to hear the rest. I grabbed my coat and left, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but for the first time in years I felt free. As I drove aimlessly through the city, I thought about all the times I'd bent over backward to make her happy, all the times I'd ignored the red flags because I didn't want to face the truth. It hurt like hell, but at least now I knew. There was no saving this marriage. Melanie had made her choice, and now I was making mine. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Melanie wasn't the type to let go quietly, and if I thought the worst was behind me, I was dead wrong. This was just the calm before the storm. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I crashed at my buddy Mike's place. Mike and I had been friends since high school, and he was the kind of guy who didn't ask too many questions. I showed up at his door with a duffel bag, and he didn't say a word, just handed me a beer and nodded toward the couch. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I wasn't wasting any time. I wanted out of this marriage, and I wanted it done cleanly. But with Melanie, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Sure enough, when I went back to the house to grab some clothes and a few essentials, she was waiting for me. The second I stepped inside, she was on me like a storm, screaming, crying, throwing every insult she could think of. "Do you know what people are going to say about you?" she spat, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "That you couldn't keep your wife happy. That you're some sad, pathetic loser who ran away when things got hard." I ignored her, heading upstairs to pack a bag. But she wasn't done. She followed me, her voice rising with every step. "And don't think you're just going to walk away with everything," she hissed. "I'll take the house. I'll take every damn penny you've got. You want a divorce? Fine. But you're going to regret it." I stopped in the doorway to the bedroom and turned to face her. "Regret what? Finally standing up for myself? Finally calling you out on your lies?" Her face twisted with anger, but then something shifted. Her eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms, a sly smile creeping onto her lips. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you, Nick? But you don't know the half of it. What the hell is that supposed to mean?" She shrugged, her smile widening. "Let's just say Tony isn't the only one I've been spending time with." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Was she bluffing? Or was she really admitting to having more than one affair? Either way, it didn't matter. I wasn't going to let her drag me any deeper into her web of lies. "Good for you," I said, my voice cold. "At least you're consistent." I walked into the bedroom and slammed the door in her face, ignoring the string of curses she hurled after me. As I packed my things, I tried to process what she just said. Was she trying to hurt me? Or was she trying to bait me into staying? Either way, it didn't matter. I was done playing her games. By the time I left the house, she had calmed down, or at least pretended to. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her face a mask of indifference. But as I walked past her, she spoke again, her tone laced with venom. "You'll come crawling back," she said, not even looking up. "They always do." I didn't respond. I just walked out the door and didn't look back. A week passed. I stayed at Mike's place while my lawyer started the divorce proceedings. Melanie, predictably, was making things as difficult as possible. She contested everything: who got the house, the car, even the damn furniture. She was dragging it out just to make my life hell. But then, something unexpected happened. One night, while I was at work, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. On the other end of the line was Tony. "Nick, man, I know you don't want to hear from me," he started, his voice tense. "But we need to talk." I nearly dropped the phone. "Are you kidding me right now? You're the last person I want to hear from." "I get it," he said quickly. "I deserve that. But this isn't about me and Melanie. This is about her." "What the hell are you talking about?" Tony hesitated, then lowered his voice like he was afraid someone might overhear. "She's been seeing someone else. Some guy named Richard. I didn't think much of it at first, but there's something off about him. I think he's dangerous." Dangerous? That didn't make any sense. Melanie might have been manipulative and self-centered, but she wasn't stupid. Why would she get involved with someone dangerous? "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, still reeling from the fact that Tony of all people was calling me. "Because I care about her, okay?" he said, his voice tight. "I know I screwed up, but I don't want anything bad to happen to her. And I don't think she's listening to me." I wanted to hang up, to tell Tony to deal with his own mess and leave me out of it. But the way he said "dangerous" stuck with me. Whether I liked it or not, I couldn't just ignore it. "What do you want me to do about it?" I finally asked. "Just keep an eye on her, man," Tony said. "If she starts acting weird, or if you hear anything about Richard, let me know." I hung up without saying goodbye. As much as I hated Tony, as much as I wanted to wash my hands of the whole mess, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And I was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. Tony's call gnawed at me. I didn't trust the guy. How could I? He'd been screwing my wife behind my back. But the tone in his voice, the way he said Melanie might be in danger, stuck with me. It wasn't like Melanie to surround herself with people who didn't benefit her in some way. Who was this? Richard. And what was she getting herself into? I tried to push it out of my mind. My focus needed to stay on the divorce and getting through the wreckage of my marriage. But the more I tried to let it go, the more I noticed strange things happening. It started with the phone calls. Late at night, around the time Melanie would normally blow up my phone to demand something or hurl insults, I started getting calls from unknown numbers. The first few times, I didn't answer. But then, one night, curiosity got the better of me. Hello? Silence. No one spoke on the other end, but I could hear faint breathing, like someone was waiting for me to say something. I hung up, my skin crawling. The next morning, I woke up to find a note slipped under the door at Mike's place. It wasn't signed, just a single line scrawled in uneven handwriting. You don't know who you're dealing with. I showed it to Mike, who shrugged it off. Probably just Melanie trying to mess with your head, he said. She's petty like that. He was probably right, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something bigger was at play. A few days later, I decided to stop by the house to grab some documents for the divorce proceedings. Melanie and I had worked out a schedule through our lawyers to avoid running into each other, so I didn't expect her to be home. But as I pulled up to the house, I noticed a black SUV parked a few doors down. The windows were tinted, and the engine was running. I parked across the street, my eyes on the SUV as I approached the house. Something about it felt off. I'd never seen it in the neighborhood before, and it wasn't the kind of car Melanie's friends drove. Inside the house, everything looked the same, but the air felt heavier. I headed to the office to grab the paperwork, but as I was rifling through the desk, I heard the front door open. Nick? Melanie's voice called out, sharp and startled. I froze. This wasn't her scheduled time, and judging by the clack of her heels and the slam of the door, she hadn't expected me to be here either. I took a deep breath and walked out to face her. What are you doing here? She demanded, her eyes narrowing. She was wearing a short black dress, her makeup done up like she was headed to some upscale cocktail party. I could ask you the same thing, I said, crossing my arms. This isn't your time. Her face hardened, but there was a flicker of something else, nervousness? Fear? I forgot something, she said quickly. What are you snooping around for? Relax, Melanie. I'm just grabbing some papers for the lawyer. I gestured toward the folder in my hand. You can go back to whatever secret rendezvous you're off to. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought she was going to start screaming again. But instead, she took a step closer, lowering her voice. You need to leave. Now. What? I frowned. This is my house too, Melanie. Not anymore, she hissed, her eyes darting toward the window. Just go, Nick. Trust me. The SUV? That was the first thing that popped into my head. Someone was waiting for her outside. Someone who didn't want me here. Who's out there? I asked, stepping toward the window. Don't, she said sharply, grabbing my arm. Her nails dug into my skin, and for a split second, I saw real fear in her eyes. Just leave, okay? It's not safe. Not safe? I yanked my arm free, my frustration boiling over. What the hell is going on, Melanie? Who's Richard? Her face went pale, and she took a step back. You need to forget that name, she whispered. Forget you ever heard it. I didn't move, didn't say anything. Melanie never acted scared, angry, vindictive, sure. But this? This was new. And it was terrifying. Please, Nick, she said, her voice breaking. Just go. Before I could press her further, a loud knock sounded at the door. Melanie's head snapped toward the sound, and she visibly flinched. Go out the back, she whispered. Now. Melanie. Go, she hissed, shoving me toward the kitchen. Against my better judgment, I did as she said. I slipped out the back door and crouched behind the fence, peeking through a crack to see what was happening. The SUV's driver was at the front door now, a tall man in a black leather jacket, his face shadowed by a baseball cap. Melanie opened the door, and though I couldn't hear their conversation, I could see her body language. She was scared, really scared. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her hands wringing together as she spoke. After a few tense moments, the man handed her something, a small, rectangular package, and then he walked back to the SUV without another word. The car pulled away, and Melanie shut the door, locking it behind her. I stayed hidden for a few minutes, my heart pounding. Whatever this was, it was way bigger than some sordid affair. Melanie was in over her head, and whether I liked it or not, I was getting dragged into it. I wasn't sure what I'd just witnessed, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just about our marriage anymore. This was something much darker, and I needed to figure out what the hell was going on before it was too late. I drove back to Mike's place with my thoughts running in circles. What had I just walked into? Who was that man, and what was in the package he handed Melanie? And why did she seem so terrified? This wasn't the Melanie I knew, or thought I knew. The fiery, bitchy woman who could cut you down with a single glance wasn't supposed to cower like that. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I replayed everything in my head: Tony's warning, Melanie's strange behavior, the SUV, the package. It was all connected, but I couldn't see how. By morning, I knew I couldn't let it go. As much as I hated Melanie, a part of me still felt responsible. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. So I did what any desperate man would do: I called Tony. Tony agreed to meet me at a diner on the edge of town. When I walked in, he was already seated in a booth, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked rough, dark circles under his eyes, his hair unkempt, like he hadn't slept much either. "Nick," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. "Didn't think I'd hear from you." "Don't get used to it," I snapped. "You said Melanie's in trouble. Start talking." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's complicated." "Uncomplicated." Tony leaned forward, his voice low. "Richard's not just some guy she's been fooling around with. He's bad news, real bad. He's got a record a mile long. Drugs, weapons, fraud. You name it, he's done it." "And Melanie?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "What's her connection to him?" Tony hesitated. "I think she owes him money. Big money. He's been using her to run errands, drop-offs, pickups. I didn't know how deep it went until a couple weeks ago." "What kind of drop-offs?" I demanded. Tony glanced around, lowering his voice even further. "Packages. Cash. Drugs. I think she's acting as a mule." I stared at him, my mind reeling. Melanie, a drug mule? It sounded insane, but the pieces were starting to fit. The late-night trips, the mysterious calls, the SUV, the package. She wasn't just cheating on me, she was playing a dangerous game, and I was caught in the middle. "Why didn't you stop her?" I asked, my voice rising. Tony shrugged helplessly. "You think I didn't try? She wouldn't listen. Said she could handle it." "Handle it?" I laughed bitterly. "She's in over her head, and now I'm the one dealing with the fallout." Tony leaned back, his expression grim. "I called you because I thought you'd care enough to help her." "I'm not helping her," I snapped. "She made her bed, Tony. Let her lie in it." But even as I said the words, I knew it wasn't that simple. Melanie might have betrayed me, but this wasn't just about her anymore. If Richard was as dangerous as Tony claimed, she wasn't the only one at risk. He could come after me, after anyone connected to her. And as much as I hated to admit it, I didn't want to see her get hurt, or worse. Later that night, I decided to confront Melanie again. I needed answers, real answers this time. I drove back to the house, my heart pounding as I rehearsed what I was going to say. But when I pulled up, the house was dark. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and the curtains were drawn. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again until finally she picked up. "What do you want, Nick?" she snapped, her voice tense. "Where are you?" I asked. "That's none of your business." "It is when you're dragging me into your mess," I said. I know about Richard, Melanie. I know what you're doing for him. There was a long pause. Then, in a voice I barely recognized, she said, You don't know anything. Then tell me. I pressed. Tell me what's going on before it's too late. She let out a bitter laugh. It's already too late, Nick. You should have stayed out of it. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my chest tightening. Something was wrong, more wrong than I'd realized. Melanie sounded defeated, like she'd given up. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of fear for her. The next morning, I got a call from my lawyer. Nick, we've got a problem, she said, her voice grim. Melanie's filed a counterclaim. She's accusing you of harassment and emotional abuse. What? I said, my head spinning. That's insane. She's also requesting a restraining order. The lawyer continued. If it's granted, it could complicate the divorce proceedings. I couldn't believe it. Melanie was turning this around on me, making me out to be the villain. But why? Was it just another manipulation, or was she trying to protect herself from something, or someone? I didn't have time to dwell on it, because later that day, I got another call. This time, it was from an unknown number. Nick, a deep, gravelly voice said. Stay away from Melanie. Who is this? I demanded, my pulse racing. Consider this your only warning, the voice said. If you keep digging, you'll regret it. The line went dead, leaving me with nothing but silence and a sinking feeling in my gut. Whoever this Richard guy was, he wasn't playing around. And if I wasn't careful, this wasn't going to end with just a messy divorce. It was going to end with someone getting hurt, or worse. The warning call shook me to my core, but it didn't stop me. If anything, it only fueled my determination to figure out what the hell Melanie had gotten herself into. I was done playing the passive victim. If someone thought they could scare me into submission, they had no idea who they were dealing with. But first, I had to cover my bases. I called my lawyer and told her everything, about the strange SUV, the shady package, and the warning call. She wasn't happy. Nick, you need to be careful, she said. If Melanie is involved with dangerous people, this isn't just about divorce anymore. You could be putting yourself in serious danger. Yeah, I got that memo, I said bitterly. But I'm not sitting back and letting her wreck my life even more. I'll do what I can to fight the restraining order, she said. But if things escalate, you need to go to the police. The police. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. Part of me knew it was the logical step, but the other part, the stubborn, vengeful part, wanted to handle this myself. Melanie had already humiliated me, broken my trust, and dragged me through hell. I wasn't going to let her or anyone else take more from me. That night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I parked a few blocks away from the house and waited. If Melanie had another meeting with her mysterious SUV friend, or Richard himself, I wanted to see it for myself. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I was about to call it a night when her car pulled into the driveway. I watched as she got out, her body language tense, glancing over her shoulder like she was expecting someone to be there. She disappeared inside, and I waited a little longer. I couldn't explain why, but something about her demeanor told me this wasn't just another normal night. I decided to take a risk. I snuck around the back of the house, peering through the kitchen window. The lights were on, and Melanie was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear. I told you I'm handling it, she was saying, her voice sharp but trembling. Just give me more time. No, I don't care what he knows, he's not a problem. Was she talking about me? My blood ran cold as I crouched lower, straining to hear the rest of the conversation. Fine, she snapped. I'll meet you there in an hour. But this is the last time. She hung up and slammed her phone on the counter, her hands shaking. I ducked behind the bushes as she stormed out of the kitchen and headed upstairs. An hour. That gave me just enough time to follow her and find out who she was meeting. When Melanie left the house, I was right behind her, careful to keep a safe distance. She drove to the outskirts of town, past the industrial district and into an area that made the motel she'd visited with Tony look like a five-star resort. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse. I parked a block away and crept closer on foot, sticking to the shadows. The place was eerily quiet, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging over the warehouse's entrance. Melanie's car was parked nearby, and the black SUV was already there, its engine idling. Melanie stepped out of her car, clutching a small bag, probably another one of Richard's packages. The man in the leather jacket emerged from the SUV, and this time, I got a better look at him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down the side of his face. His presence screamed intimidation. They exchanged a few words, too low for me to hear, and then he grabbed the bag from her. Melanie looked visibly shaken, her hands wringing together as she spoke. The man nodded once, then motioned toward the warehouse. Melanie hesitated, shaking her head. Whatever he was asking her to do, she didn't like it. But when he stepped closer, his voice low and threatening, she finally relented. She followed him inside, and the door slammed shut behind them. I should have left. Any sane person would have walked away, let the cops deal with it, and called it a day. But I wasn't sane, not anymore. This was my wife, my life, and my mess, and I wasn't about to sit on the sidelines. I crept around the building, looking for another way in. Finally, I found a broken window near the back, just wide enough to slip through. I landed silently on the dusty concrete floor, my heart pounding as I moved toward the sound of voices. What I saw made my blood run cold. Inside the warehouse, Melanie was standing in front of a table covered in cash, drugs, and what looked like firearms. Richard, the man with the scar, was leaning over the table, his voice low and menacing. "You think this is a game?" he growled. "You're already late with your payment, and now you're trying to back out?" "I'll get the money," Melanie stammered. "I just need more time." Richard laughed coldly, shaking his head. "Time isn't something you have, sweetheart. You've got 1 week. And if you screw this up..." He pulled a gun from the table and set it down in front of her. "You'll wish you hadn't." Melanie's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She nodded quickly, grabbing the bag of cash and backing away toward the door. That's when I stepped on a loose piece of metal, the clatter echoing through the warehouse like a gunshot. Richard's head snapped up, and his hand went to his gun. "Who's there?" he barked. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Melanie turned toward the noise, her eyes locking onto mine. For a split second, I saw something in her expression, fear, desperation, maybe even guilt. Then she screamed. "It's him!" she shouted. "He followed me!" Before I could react, Richard stormed toward me, his gun raised. My cover was blown, and the nightmare I'd been trying to untangle had just become very real. The sound of Melanie's scream echoed through the warehouse, sending a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I didn't have time to think. Richard was coming straight for me, his gun drawn and his face twisted with rage. Instinct took over. I bolted toward the nearest stack of crates, diving behind them just as a gunshot rang out. The sound was deafening, the bullet splintering the edge of the crate inches from my head. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Come out, you little rat!" Richard bellowed, his footsteps heavy on the concrete. "You think you can stick your nose in my business and walk away?" I crouched lower, my mind racing. This wasn't how I'd expected this to go. I thought I was coming here to uncover Melanie's secrets, maybe even confront her. I hadn't planned on dodging bullets. "Nick!" Melanie's voice rang out, shrill and panicked. "Just leave! Get out of here before he kills you!" Her words were meant to sound like concern, but there was no mistaking the edge of accusation in her tone. As if this was my fault. As if she hadn't dragged me into this mess by lying, cheating, and aligning herself with a criminal. I peeked around the corner of the crate just in time to see Richard stalking toward where I was hiding, his gun raised. My options were limited, and none of them were good. I needed to think fast. Spotting a rusty metal pipe on the ground, I grabbed it and waited until he was close enough. As soon as he stepped around the corner, I swung with all my strength, catching him in the wrist. The gun clattered to the ground, and I didn't waste a second. I lunged for it, but Richard was quicker, slamming his boot into my ribs and knocking the air out of me. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he growled, hauling me to my feet by the collar of my shirt. But guts don't mean a damn thing when you're dead. Before he could do anything else, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Both of us froze, turning toward the source of the noise. The warehouse door had been kicked open, and flashing blue and red lights spilled inside. "Police! Drop your weapon and put your hands in the air!" a voice boomed. Richard cursed under his breath, shoving me aside. He grabbed his bag of cash and bolted toward the back exit, disappearing into the shadows. I stayed on the ground, clutching my ribs as officers swarmed the warehouse, their guns drawn. One of them approached me, his flashlight blinding. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I'm fine," I managed, wincing as I tried to sit up. "He went that way." The officer nodded, signaling to his team to pursue Richard. As they fanned out, I spotted Melanie being escorted toward one of the patrol cars. She was crying now, her face streaked with makeup, but I wasn't buying the act. Not anymore. Hours later, I was sitting in the police station, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee and trying to piece everything together. The detectives had taken my statement, and while they seemed skeptical at first, the evidence in the warehouse backed up my story. Richard was the real target, and Melanie, well, she was a wild card. Eventually, one of the detectives came in and sat across from me. His expression was grim. "We've been tracking Richard for a while," he said. "Your wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, I assume, was in deep. She wasn't just running errands for him. She was laundering money, dealing drugs, and facilitating illegal arms deals." The words hit me like a freight train. I knew Melanie had lied to me, betrayed me, but this? This was on another level. I couldn't believe the woman I'd married, the woman I'd once loved, was capable of something so monstrous. "What happens to her now?" I asked, my voice hollow. "She's being charged," the detective said. "But she's also agreed to cooperate with our investigation. If she gives us enough to take Richard down, she might get a reduced sentence." I nodded numbly. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction, vindication. She was finally facing the consequences of her actions. But all I felt was emptiness. A week later, I finalized the paperwork for the divorce. Melanie tried to reach out to me from jail, letters, phone calls, even a message through her lawyer, but I ignored every attempt. She had made her choices, and now she was living with them. As for me, I moved out of Mike's place and into a small apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a fresh start, free from the chaos that had consumed my life for far too long. In the end, I learned that betrayal doesn't just come from infidelity. It comes from lies, from manipulation, from the people who take your trust and twist it into something ugly. But I also learned something else. Walking away isn't weakness. It's strength. It's survival. Melanie and I were over, and for the first time in years, I felt free.